So tell us how you got here.
Well, first of all, when my mother announced we were moving to Mexico, we were three girls and we were like, no, we don't want to move to Mexico. So she had to get us ready for Mexico. So we came and spent the summer of 1957 in San Miguel, living at the Instituto Hotel. And we went to a little bit of language school and we got to go horseback riding and roam around town and meet a few friends. And so by the time we came back in January of '58, we were pretty much ready and looking forward to living in San Miguel.
So how old were you then?
I was 12.
Oh, 12, very young.
Yeah. And we got to San Miguel at the end of January because we'd been in school in Fort Worth, Texas for the first semester of junior high school for me was 7th grade. And 7th grade was split up between Fort Worth, Texas and Augusta's school in San Miguel Allende. So I started at Augusta's the last week in January of '58. And Georgie started 9th grade, so she was my older sister. Our younger sister, Christina, went to Santo Domingo School up on, it's called Instituto Las Casas, but everybody called it Santo Domingo. And there were other American children in school at Santo Domingo, but my mother wanted Georgie and me to be at Augusta's school. And she'd asked Augusta ahead of time, you know, if she could handle both of us and what her student body was like. And we were the only, I was the only 7th grader and Georgie was the only 9th grader. But Augusta did a fabulous job with us. Augusta Irving was a native New Yorker and she was with New York Public School System. And I have a feeling that maybe McCarthyism drove her out of the USA. I think she got here about 54, 55. And I think she was sort of a refugee from McCarthyism. I think she was quite liberal or progressive, or maybe her friends were, but anyway, I think it was time for her to leave the USA. And she came to San Miguel and started the Escuela Blanca, and we knew some of her first students, but we were among her first students that are still alive and know where each other are. So we're trying to get together people who were there we were there in '58, '59, and we know a lot of people who went to Augusta School in the '60s and '70s, and we're trying to compile a lot of writings from her students because she was such an amazing teacher, wonderful character, and absolutely a positive influence on our lives. Apparently she was divorced when she got here, and then while she was here, after we left and left San Miguel, she married Ramon Ramirez, and he was her second husband, and they were together until he died, and then until she died. So there were also Mexican students. There were people here who wanted their children to have an English language education. So English was the core of it. Because Georgie and I didn't speak much Spanish, she had a woman come in the afternoon who did conversational Spanish and grammar and so forth with us in the afternoon as sort of a private tutorial class. Because the rest of the kids were younger generally and they already spoke Spanish. So I think she came with the idea of starting a school. She was such a natural teacher.
And what was the classroom like? How many students normally in a given year?
It was number 33 Zacateros Street. Okay. And it was, her house was the front, so you would walk through her patio and garden and down some stairs into a classroom that she built that had large windows on 3 sides, and all of us were in one room, and then later she added another classroom a little below on her property, I think in the 60s, but we left in 1959. So we didn't know about the second classroom. So we were all in one class. We had the first, second, third, fourth, fifth graders, and the older kids, there were 4 of us older kids, were sort of in charge of helping the younger kids when it came time for them to read their lessons or to do something that they needed to do with another person. Georgie and I and Carol Wyatt and Peter would be in charge of giving them their classwork and working with them. But she had insomnia, and every night she would write down my lesson for the day, and I would have a spiral notebook and it'd say, Mary Lou, today you need to read in biology such and such pages, and you need to do this in math, and you need to do this in history, and when you finish 3 or 4 of your subjects, come and sit by me and tell me what you've learned. So, and then we had to write a composition every week and a book report every month. And there was a dictionary in the corner, and all the little kids and the big kids, if we said, what does this mean? we had to go to the dictionary and look it up. So and then once a week or once a month, her New Yorker magazine would arrive, and she would underline things and pass it around to us and show us the jokes and tell us what articles were good and so forth. Basically, we had to be very conversant, and we had to learn to dialogue with adults, and we got very good at that. So
you thought it was a very good education?
A great education, and in the year I was at Augusta, she tested us. When we first came in, she gave us Metropolitan Achievement Tests and California State Achievement Tests, and then she tested us when we left. And in a year and a half, I advanced between 3 and 5 years in all subjects.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, in terms of vocabulary, reading, everything. I wasn't really great. I only did a year and a half in math, and I think a year and a half in science, but the rest was always up there, I think, at college level. And I was halfway through 8th grade when I left. So. And her star student was right at the same time we arrived, was Nicholas Schlee, and he was her big star, and he went on to Yale School of Drama and became an architect, and he spoke 4 languages and had 2 passports, and he was sort of the star of San Miguel. So Nicholas did really well under Augusta's tutelage.
When did she close it?
I think she closed it, my guess is probably in around 90-91.
So she had a 40-year career here, more or less, 40-year career.
Mm-hmm. And I remember her 40th birthday. And I think she was an August 21st baby. She was right in there. And she made dynamite margaritas. And I remember going to cocktail parties in her house, which was the front part of the school. And I remember when I came back, I'd been living in Europe for 3 years, and I came back and knocked on her door. I was 17, I think, 16 or 17. And I said, Augusta. And she said, you'll have to tell me who you are. And I said, Mary Lou. And she said, I thought you were a countess or something. Come in and have a margarita. But yeah, she was definitely a wonderful, wonderful conversationalist. You knew an Augusta sentence when you heard it. And she was a wonderful writer. And I think she really encouraged Georgie in her writing. So when we moved to Europe, Georgie was 15 and I was 13. And Georgie immediately started sending in newspaper articles for our hometown newspaper about what it was like traveling with her family in Europe when she was 15 and 16. And I think she actually got paid for some of her articles for newspapers. And she majored in journalism when she started college. So Augusta was a huge influence on both of us.
What was your daily life like here at San Miguel on 58?
There weren't a lot of teenagers, and most of the children in town were younger than us. And Georgie became sort of the leader of the adventure group. I think when we left the States, we were very into Peter Pan and Captain Hook, and I was always first mate Smee. And Georgie was always Captain Hook. But she enlisted all the younger boys into going out to the canyon and walking the pipe and making spears and throwing spears and pretending that they were, wild men of Borneo or whatever. And all the little boys just adored Georgie, so they followed her around. I was a drama queen. I wanted to be a ballet dancer and a movie actress. And when we were, I think, maybe 7 and 9 years old. Our father died when I was 5 and she was 7, but adults used to always ask us, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would say, a ballet dancer, a Hollywood star, a movie actress, and Georgie would say, an archaeologist. And she got all the attention. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be getting the attention. What's an archaeologist? What is this that's getting her the attention? So I thought I better look into this so that I could get more. This is traditional sibling rivalry.
But you did become an archaeologist.
And she became a fabulous, wonderful K-1 Montessori teacher and influenced hundreds of young lives in her teaching career, and I think she probably did a better job for the planet than I've done, but who knows. It was very liberating, but what was so fun is I think we'd been in a very structured society in a awful town in Texas called Midland, Texas, which, what can I say about Midland, Texas? But it was very structured and very white, middle class, college educated, blah, blah. And this was just adventure. We had our horses and we would go out exploring and looking for caves and looking for archaeological sites. And when right about my 13th birthday, I think about Georgie's 15th birthday, we heard about a place near San Miguel that had pyramids. And we thought, oh, we want to go explore this place. So we went out with two friends on our horses, and we went out to La Cañada de la Virgen, but nobody called it that. Nobody knew what it was. And we woke up in the morning and took some pictures of these pyramids. And we, had adventures because we got there as it was getting dark, and we put our sleeping bags on the ground. And we woke up in the morning. We would have, if we'd gone a few more, I have to say, yards, we might have fallen right down into the canyon because we were right on the lip of the canyon.
So you went out alone as kids?
We went out, Georgie, me, Linton, who was 15, and Bruce King, who was 15 or 16. So 2 boys, 2 girls, and a guide named Roberto. And Roberto was going to show us where it was because his family knew about it. He didn't live there, but he knew about it. And so the people who lived there were a rancher and his family, and they did rope tricks for us, and they posed for photos, and we took photos. And we came back to San Miguel on our horses the next day, and we told our parents, and they said they thought we were kidding. And so they said they were going to go. You couldn't get there by car. Yeah. So they were going to go and get horses and go with us. So they went back with us and they said, this really is an archaeological site. So we were archaeologists. We had discovered the Cañada de la Virgen, but in fact we were the first people we knew of in San Miguel
to go
who
out there.
Did that, yeah.
And did that inspire your love for archaeology maybe?
Absolutely, absolutely. We had arrived. We had found our own archaeological site. And we went to the opening of the library the day it opened, and they had mariachis, and the first time anybody asked me to dance, somebody who could have been my grandfather, Louis Balmer, asked me to dance, and I thought, wow, do I know how to dance? I don't know. And that was when the library started. That was the first day that it was open.
Now this was all English speaking, or was it bilingual back then?
It was bilingual, but a lot of the early supporters of the library were Americans. Let's see, what else did we do? We went to the Sábado de Gloria New Year's Eve thing at the Fronton Club, which was down on Hidalgo Street, and we got to stay up until almost midnight because it was Easter weekend, and I think there's a big celebration, and the dancing starts after midnight because Christ is risen type of thing. And so I remember going to that dance. And I remember going to a lot of parties, and we had a Halloween party up in Santo Domingo Street with the Dixon kids. And it was, we all dressed up as ghosts and goblins and so forth. And there was a group of 20 or 30 kids of all different ages who did a lot of things together, as well as horseback riding and parties and so forth. But one of my favorite San Miguel stories that my mother doesn't tell, I don't think, is in '58, in the summer of '58, my mother was dating a young photojournalist who was living over the Infierno bar named Gordon Kempe, and everybody would go to parties, and there was a cocktail party almost every night. But you've got to remember, San Miguel had no TV, no newspaper, no radio, no telephones. So you couldn't invite people to your cocktail party because maybe you could send out your criada with notes or something. But this was a pretty much open group that would always go to the same parties. And there was a fellow in town named Dennis Wiegand, and his wife was Lois. And they had a yellow dog, with a bandana around its neck named Blackie. And Blackie knew where the party would be. So if you wanted to find the party, you would follow Blackie and bring your 30-cent bottle of tequila to go to the party. And everybody would tell outrageous lies, and everybody would make up stories. And I mean, there were no newspapers and TV, so everybody was free to fabricate whatever they wanted to. But one of these parties my mother and Gordon had gone to, and they were told that the Pan American Highway was finished all the way to Guatemala, and you could take your American car and go to Guatemala and sell it for 3 times more than it was worth in the States or in San Miguel. So they decided to elope and leave us here with friends, and because we were all in school, and they were going to get married in Oaxaca and take the car to Guatemala. And of course that turned into one of the most outrageous stories I've ever written, but it was all a lie. The Pan American Highway wasn't finished, and they had to put their car on a flatbed car on a train, and it was just one of these horrendous stories that after 3 days on their honeymoon they had killed each other. But anyway, that was typical of San Miguel parties in the old days, is a lot of enjoyment and a lot of telling wild stories and carrying on. The road to Querétaro was fixed, and from Querétaro you would go to San Juan del Rio, and then I remember several times we went through Toluca to get to Mexico City.
How long would it take?
I think it took us maybe 4 or 5 hours.
That's not too much longer than today.
And we would always go to Sanborn's, and we would buy Mad magazines. I think Mad magazines had just come out then. Yeah. And of course candy. And we were all very upset that San Miguel did not have good candy. And Georgie and I, we lived on Barranca, we both got hepatitis together. And my mother had hepatitis too, and the only one who didn't was our little sister, Christina. And we would lie there pitifully with our centavos and ask Christina to buy us taficos. And she would say, I have to do my homework. We were like, no, we can't get out of bed. We're supposed to be on total bed rest. And we would, grovel and offer to pay her her extra money and shine her shoes for going to Santo Domingo the next day if she would go buy us taficos and other candy. Because actually when you have hepatitis, you're supposed to have sort of a high carbohydrate diet. I just remember my stepfather Gordon saying this is just like a U.S. fire expert's nightmare. And Gordon also used to say, San Miguel is great as long as the only thing you have to do all day is pick up your mail and get a haircut. Anything beyond that, and it's going to take you way too many hours in the day to do anything. But Christina also, when we here on Barranca, the hot water heater blew up in her face and burned her eyebrows. And I was so upset, and she was hysterical. And my mother and Gordon had just left to go to the Ángela Peralta movie theater. And I ran all the way to the Ángela Peralta, and I can swear that it only took me about 3 minutes to go from Barranca to the Ángela Peralta. And I said, she's burned, and you got to come back. And she's seriously burned and everything. And she was fine. She didn't have any scars or anything. But we used to go to the Ángela Peralta all the time.
So there was regular movies there?
This regular movies, and the ground floor was 3 pesos, and the balcony was 2 pesos, and for 1 peso you could sit in the top, the 3rd floor, and we saw more movies at the Ángela Peralta and bought more popcorn that had probably been swept up off the floor from the previous showing, but we thought it was great. So, and yes, it was a really safe place for children. I cannot remember ever being scared, and we used to, unfortunately, we had some bad habits, which is teasing drunks. And we called it borracho tag, and when there would be a borracho coming down the street, we would get real close and run, and anyway, not something kids can brag about. We went out to a lake, and you could rent rowboats.
But not the Presa, this is pre-Presa.
This is pre-Presa. Yeah. And it was a lake sort of on the road to Dolores Hidalgo on the right, And it may have been just a pond that a farmer had, but a farmer was renting rowboats. And we all threw rocks at each other's rowboats and splashed them in the water, and everybody got wet. And what else? We went up to the Cueva del Diablo, where supposedly they were doing witchcraft. But we were always looking for wild adventures. Walking the pipe was the most dangerous. And other children later did get injured, but we could have been killed. You would go up to where the Charco is now, and there was a pipe that still is there on the rim of the canyon, and there's sort of a waterfall going in the center of the canyon, going down to the Fabrica, which is now, I guess, some kind of tourist resort and restaurants and shopping and so forth. But that was the factory that made the Agricola sacks, made sacks out of cotton, and it was run by the Garay family, Paco Garay and his brother and his cousin. They were Spaniards, and they had homes right there as you're driving out of town going to Dolores Hidalgo. And the pipe, after it left the canyon, would go straight down the hillside. I think the pipe might still be there.
So it was very large, like water pipe? Or...
Yeah, it was about maybe 5-6 feet in diameter. And we, of course, never told our parents because our parents would have had a fit. Later, Max Bleileben got really hurt walking the pipe, but other kids after us wanted to do something daring and dangerous, and that was daring and dangerous. And I remember at some point, I must have had a flash of recognition about how dangerous it was, because I remember at the end of going over this really dangerous area, I just got down and scooted along the pipe. I couldn't stand up and walk because I was afraid I would lose my balance and fall to my death, because it really was falling to your death. So, very dangerous stuff. Up on the Salida Querétaro, there was a woman artist from Texas who was quite a good artist named Dottie Turner. And Dottie Turner had a wonderful horse, and she was living on nothing. There were so many people in those days who were like literally starving artists. And she sold me her horse, but she kept it. And I loved that horse. I have pictures of me the day we left at the railroad station. Dottie Turner brought my horse to say goodbye to me. So Christina took her horse Spooky, and Spooky was not my Rayo. It was a very sort of skinny horse with its hips sticking out. And anyway, Robert Mitchum said, "Is that your horse?" And Christina said, "Yes." "What's his name?" "Spooky." "He's the ugliest horse I've ever seen in my life." Broke her heart. She tells another story that I think is true, that years later, she was back in San Miguel. She was 21. She had a horse named Bhagavad Gita, and Gita lived in the back of the Villa Santa Monica. And she was walking Gita down the street to bring him back from a ride and put him away. And a black limo comes up, and the window of the black limo rolls down, and it's Robert Mitchum. And she's waited all these years to get back at Robert Mitchum. I think this is a true story. I have to have Christina to verify it. But he said, "Is that your horse?" "What's his name?" "He's the ugliest horse I've ever seen in my life." And Christina apparently tried to attack him, and the window went up, and the car sped away. I came back. I was here in '68 when she bought the villa. I went to the University of Colorado. I married when I was 19. I graduated from the University of Colorado when I was 21. I got my first job within 2 weeks of graduation as a child welfare worker for the Adams County Department of Public Welfare in Brighton, Colorado, deciding that I was going to support my graduate student husband. He never went to a class. After a year, I realized this is a dream. This marriage is never going to work. I'm going to run away to Mexico and become an archaeologist. And I ditched my first husband. My mother met me at the train station in Celaya because I was coming from El Paso, not from Laredo. And when she saw me get off the plane, she said, looks like you're divorcing. And I said, yes, as a matter of fact. She said, you want to go to Guatemala? Anyway, that was August of '68. So I moved back to San Miguel in August of '68.
And so did you help her with the renovations of the villa? Or?
Indirectly, yeah. I did go to graduate school. I did become an archaeologist. I lived in San Miguel from '68 until '74.
Oh, you did? Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yep. And off and on, I lived in Guanajuato, working for the government of Guanajuato. I lived in Mexico City because I helped excavate the subway in Mexico City, and I lived in Cholula, Puebla, because the university moved to Cholula. So I lived in San Miguel, basically, but when I was in Mexico City and Cholula, I came to San Miguel every weekend, and I used to charge other students, want to go to San Miguel with me? It'll be $10 for a ride. So yeah.
So any fond memories or stories from the early days of the Villa Santa Monica or being here now in the 70s as an older person?
We had more fun at the Villa Santa Monica. It was just a dream come true for all of us. And I have lots of anecdotes about all those early days at the Villa Santa Monica, but I don't think you have time in the interview for that. I'm going through my mother's papers right now, and I just found a letter written to my mother in 1970 about how much he'd enjoyed staying at the villa. And by the way, he's a botanist, and by the way, he's going to recommend this kind of grass that she should plant at the villa. And I get down to the part where he recommends a guy in Mexico City as an expert on agriculture named Richard Fromater. I know Richard Fromater, and I just saw him last Sunday because he's became an Episcopal priest. He lives in Antigua, Guatemala. He grew up in Mexico City, and he's traveled around the world as with AID as an expert on our agriculture. Anyway, Richard Fromater and I are good friends, and I thought, well, that was a guest at my mother's hotel. But for a while, one time, she would always love to go to Rancho Rio Caliente, and which is a hot spring spa with yoga and vegetarian food near Guadalajara. And she would always turn to a hotel guest and say, could you just run this place for me while I go off to Rancho Rio Caliente? And so she'd gone off once and left Christina, my sister, and me in charge of this. And we got a letter, and I won't mention her name because she might still be living, from a very stuffy woman who wanted to have a special diet and special soaps and tennis lessons for her husband and blah, 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 blah about all this stuff, all of her expectations. And we just answered it, and we said, dear Mrs. Smith, have you ever been to Mexico before? Thank you very much, the administration of the Villa Santa Monica. But when she had a problem guest, she would try to gently ease them over to Jorge Palomino's, which was the Sierra Nevada. And one time she had a very difficult guest, and she said, Jorge, do you have a room available? And so she sent this woman over, and Jorge said, Betty, what have you done to me? So we really got to be such good friends with so many guests of my mother's that it provided us with a social life for the rest of my life. I can go anywhere in the world and look up people that I met at the Villa Santa Monica. So, and it provided her with the same thing. And she was going to, I guess, a trip with Elder Hostel or something to the Hudson River Valley, and she wanted one of her daughters to go with her, and we all were doing something else. And my sister Georgie said, look, if you go with this Elder Hostel group to the Hudson River Valley, I will make you a bet right now that by the second night, you will have met at least 2 people you know. Georgie won the bet. The minute they all stood up and introduced themselves, 2 people said, Betty Kempe, San Miguel Allende. So yeah, I met my husband Jay in San Miguel at the Villa Santa Monica. And we had just sat down for lunch, and I'd been working with the Stanford Summerfield Project School in Guanajuato in San Francisco, and I'd come back. George had just come back. We were all sitting down having lunch with my mother, who we never got to see because she was so busy. And a fellow stuck his head in the dining room and said, "Oh, Betty, can I speak to you a moment?" And we all looked at each other, and I said, "I'll do it." So I just went and said, he was there with his wife and 3 daughters. I said, "Could you come back some other time? We're having a special lunch for my mother." That's how I met my husband, Jay, at the Villa Santa Monica. I threw him out, basically. But he kept coming back, and he kept saying, you know, your mother says you're an archaeologist, and, you know, my family and I are really interested in archaeology. And so I thought, well, so he asked me if I would help him learn a lot about local archaeology and about local museums and collections and take him around to sites and everything. So he and his wife were so charming and wonderful. And his 3 daughters were here, and they were just a lovely family. So I thought, this is great. I have another month before I go to San Francisco to go to an archaeology conference, and I'll hang out with these nice people. So I introduced them to all my friends in San Miguel. And they asked me the last day they were here if I would sit down with them and tell them where they should have a second home in Central America. They weren't considering Mexico. And I looked at their list, and I thought, no, this is ridiculous. No, Panama, no. Costa Rica, forget it. Honduras, no. Nicaragua, the Corn Islands. So I just looked at Jay and Marilyn, and I said, no, if this were me with 3 daughters the ages of your daughters, I would not live anywhere in Central America except Antigua, Guatemala. Well, how do you spell that? Well, where is that? Well, why do you think Antigua? And I said, it's just like San Miguel. It was founded in the same year. It's a World Heritage Site. It's cobblestone streets, but it's also got wonderful schools, and it's got beautiful gardens, and it's culturally a very worthwhile place to live and raise a family, I would think. I was already hot to live in Antigua, Guatemala myself, obviously. Anyway, he had told me when I met them that his wife was dying of breast cancer, but I didn't believe him. And I thought, this beautiful young 39-year-old woman, no, this is not. They were both 39 years old. It seems like they were so young now. Anyway, she died. She died within 5 weeks of that meeting.
Oh my God.
And he sat down with his 3 girls, and he said, I can't be here in Chicago with memories of your mother. We're going to continue this trip to Central America, and we have the tickets. And the last place on the list was Antigua, Guatemala. So they went to Panama and Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Honduras, and ending up at the airport in Guatemala City saying, take me to Antigua, Guatemala. And he went to Antigua only because I told him to. He didn't know anybody. He didn't speak a word of Spanish. He got to Antigua. He had been there for about 10 days, and he freaked out and woke up one morning and said, what have I done? What am I doing here? Why am I here? So he called my mother. And my mother said, Jay, calm down. You know, I did the same thing. I moved to San Miguel as a widow with 3 daughters and so forth. Go to language school, put the girls in school, rent a house, learn Spanish, hire a maid and a cook. And my mother gave him a roadmap to surviving in Guatemala. So he really, after 6 months, I joined him there, but he was like the local chamber of commerce. He thought Antigua, Guatemala was the most fabulous place he'd ever seen, with the most wonderful weather he'd ever seen, and he thought he had just gone to heaven living in Antigua, Guatemala, and he felt that way until the day he died. So Jay wrote me letters, and that's back before cell phones. And he said that he was living in Antigua, Guatemala, and he'd run into this elderly gentleman who was going to teach him the secrets and sell him these jade mines. And I wrote him a snotty letter back. And I said, there is no jade in the Americas, only jadeite. I thought I was the great archaeologist because that's what my professor told me in graduate school. I didn't know that jadeite is jade. Anyway, so I said, somebody's trying to sell you a bill of goods and you're a dumb gringo, and you know, there's no, forget this. So Jay decided, well, gotta, make my point here. So he went to Washington, D.C., went to the Library of Congress, asked the head librarian what was her favorite restaurant in Washington, D.C., and he said, I will take you there for the best lunch you've ever had in your life. I want you to photocopy for me. In those days, you said Xerox for me. Everything you have on pre-Columbian jade, Maya jade, Guatemalan jade, and I will take you to your favorite restaurant. And so he came back to Guatemala with 40 pounds of photocopies. But what he'd gotten was a treasure map to find the jade in Guatemala. And it was a monograph written by the head geologist at the Smithsonian in 1957 who had spent 20 years of his life looking for jade in Guatemala and never found it. And this guy on page 13 says, dig here and you'll find jade, but nobody ever read his publication. The Smithsonian never distributed it because he died when it was still in press. And so when I read everything Jay had gotten in Washington, D.C., I said, I believe you. This is a worthwhile project. I'm in. Count me in. Let's go look for the jade in Guatemala. So
And you found it.
we found it.